the main thing to remember about this year's elections, I think, is that it didn't really resolve any of the pretty pressing California issues that predate the current crisis of pandemic and recession, that have been there for year after year after year, and have kind of defied any attempts to resolve. And probably the two or three most prominent one of those is, first of all, housing. The election didn't affect housing really, other than it killed one rent control measure. So maybe it might help if that danger of rent control isn't over the head. Maybe it'll encourage some more investment in rental housing. But housing continues to be a major issue in California. And we're seeing that in the midst of pandemic. We're having a boom in housing sales, which seems strange in a way, but it reflects the fact that there are low interest rates, and reflects the fact that there is a pent-up strong demand for housing in California that hasn't been met recently. How big? Well, this is the way it works out. These are the numbers of housing in California. We have in the past, 15, 16, 17 years ago, built as many as 200,000 housing units a year. And then during the last big recession, there was the worst recession since the Great Depression, until this recession came along, and now it's the worst recession since the Great Depression. But in that last recession that started in the middle of the last decade, housing construction dropped to as low as 30,000 units a year. And it's never really caught up from that. We've kind of struggled to get up to about 100,000 units a year, maybe a little bit more. But in net terms, because in addition to the new housing that you build, you have to subtract the old housing that goes away. The housing that's lost to fires, and we've seen a lot of that. The housing that's lost to old age or being demolished for some other purpose, the land for some other purpose. So we've never even gotten back up to about 100,000 units net a year. The state says we should be building about 180,000 units a year to meet current demand and also catch up on the backlog. But we haven't done that yet. We're a long ways from that. And as every year that goes by that we don't do that, then the gap between demand and supply grows wider. It's a very, very thorny issue. The biggest need in housing is for moderate income to low income, probably rental housing. The market takes care pretty much of the housing for owner-occupied housing. The market's there, but the market has not taken care of the need for lower and moderate income housing. And it's a huge thing. It costs, and this is an astounding number, but it's a verified number, let me say. It costs somewhere in the neighborhood of average about $400,000 to build one unit of so-called affordable housing. So that's the low end of the market. It still costs about $400,000 if it's done with governmental funds and tax credits and all the ways they do this sort of thing, about $400,000. And in some coastal areas of California, it goes up to as much as, believe it or not, $1 million a unit to build affordable housing. So when you look at the numbers of the need and you look at that fact about how much it costs to build even one unit of housing, we're talking about the need for literally tens of billions of dollars a year into the housing market in housing construction. Government doesn't have that kind of money. Nobody in government has that kind of money. And the only way that's going to be resolved probably is to somehow incentivize the private market to move in. And that means a whole bunch of things like cutting red tape, trying to, all the sorts of things you can do to probably lower that cost to make housing more attractive to private investment. So that's a problem that continues on. When Gavin Newsom was running for governor 2 years ago, he blithely promised that he was going to build 3.5 million units of housing by the middle of the 20s of this decade. Well, no, it's not. It was never going to happen. That was just that was blue sky, but not even close, not even in the same ballpark. We'd have to be building like 600,000 units a year. That's just not that's not going to happen. It's simply not going to happen. Even under the best of times, it was about 200,000 a year. That's a problem. One of the other problems that remains unresolved and has kind of been, like housing, kind of pushed aside a little bit during this pandemic is water. The problem of water, of how water is allocated and priced and distributed, all that thing. It goes round and round and round every year. I've been covering California politics in one form or another for, I think, about 55 years, believe it or not. And spent a lot of that time working on water issues. And the basic problem is the same today as it was 55 years ago and probably before that. California in total does not have a water shortage. This is not Arizona. This is not Nevada. We get a lot of water. A lot of water falls on California. Yes, we've had dry seasons and wet seasons, but in an average year, there's water there. The question is basically how it is captured, how it is distributed, and how it's priced. And nobody knows how to make that happen. I mean, it goes round and round and round because you have all these competing interests: agricultural interests, domestic business interests, the municipal interests, and they all go around and around. Who's going to get it? Who's going to pay for it? And they just basically fight to a draw. And so nothing really happens year after year. It would take an enormous political effort to try to truly resolve California's water issues in some sort of rational basis. But it's not going away. Fortunately, our population isn't growing nearly as fast as it once was, which affects both housing and water demand, but it's still there. We still have this basic issue of how water is to be distributed and priced, and we can't seem to get there from here. The third big issue that's also kind of been set aside during this crisis is homelessness, which is obviously tied to the housing shortage, but it's a bigger, more complicated issue than simply a lack of housing, because people are on the streets, and there are at least 150,000 of them in California, have all sorts of problems in terms of drug addiction, mental illness, alcoholism. There's a social and medical component to the homelessness problem. And so the issue goes round and round. Do you do housing first and take care of those other problems later? Do you take care of the problems first, housing later? It goes round and round and round. And people apply Band-Aids to it by building a few units here or turning a motel into temporary housing or whatnot, but it doesn't really resolve the issue. Another issue, like water and like housing, that seems to be intractable and that periodically politicians promise to solve, but nobody's been able to hit it yet. And then there are issues that are very important, but don't really have the sort of public awareness that housing and water and homelessness do. It's not kind of right there in front of your face. And I would say those are intertwined issues of educational and economic disparity. One thing this pandemic has done, both the medical part of the pandemic and the economic part of the pandemic, is that it has widened the gap in California between those who are doing well and those who aren't doing well. California, as probably everyone should know by now, has the highest level of poverty, functional poverty, of any state in the nation. Now, what I mean by functional poverty is the official poverty rate is one thing. It hasn't been changed in 60 years or so, but there's a thing called the supplemental poverty rate that everybody now acknowledges is the true poverty rate, or closer to the true poverty rate, which takes into account the cost of living. And the cost of living in California is very high, particularly for housing. As a result of which, we have the highest level of functional poverty as calculated by the Census Bureau of any state in the United States, up in the neighborhood of 15 to 20%. I can't remember the exact current number, but it's in that range, which doesn't sound terribly high, but it is terribly high, in fact. And the Public Policy Institute of California has using the same methodology as the Census Bureau, has calculated poverty rates for California and individual counties. And they also calculate that about another 17% or so of Californians, and this is before the pandemic, by the way, are near poverty. In other words, you're just like one paycheck away from being poverty stricken. So you really put all that together, you're talking about probably a third of California's population, maybe as many as 13, 14 million people are in fact in great economic distress. The pandemic and the recession has made it worse by far, because people at the lower economic rungs on the ladder are the ones most affected by the slowdown. They're the people who've lost their jobs in restaurants, in hotels, in other small businesses. People in blue or white collar jobs are able to do them at home. They have not, I say they, we have not suffered nearly to the extent that people who work in small businesses and service industries, particularly in the hotel, restaurant, travel, those fields, terrible devastation in terms of unemployment. Moreover, they are more likely to, because they can't work from home and they have to go to work when they have jobs, they are more likely to contract a COVID-19. So it's hit. There's a class element to this pandemic. And allied to that is that the children in those poor families are falling further behind their more privileged peers because they too lack the facilities and the other support mechanisms to be able to be schooled at home, particularly if they have working parents. Whereas people in white collar upper income families, they can school their kids, they can stay home, they can do their jobs, they can hire tutors, they can do whatever is necessary. So the educational disparity has also widened in this thing. It was already very, very wide in California. Think about this, 60% of California's K-12 public school students, 60%, that's about 3.5 million kids are either poor or English learners, and they are not keeping up with their peers in terms of educational attainment. So those are some of the things that are kicking around. They are not really affected by this election. They were there before the election. They were there before the pandemic. If anything, they've gotten worse because of the pandemic and particularly because of the recession. And we don't know how long those conditions are going to last. We literally do not know. And the governor says that we cannot expect any kind of widespread vaccination, immunization until maybe well into next year, halfway or 3/4 of the way into next year. They're just now coming out with vaccines, but those vaccines are still in the final testing stages. They're difficult to administer. They're difficult to store. For example, the vaccine that Pfizer announced a few days ago has to be kept at minus 70 degrees centigrade. And it takes 2 successive inoculations to make it work. It's going to be a while. It's going to be a long time before we see a widespread vaccination against this terrible disease. And the economic effects are going to last as well. California has one of the highest unemployment rates of any state in the nation currently. It had actually broken an all-time record earlier in the year. It got up to around 13-14%. It's now down a little bit from that, down into the 10-11% range, but that's still among the highest in the country. So the economic effects of this are going to go on for a while, and some of those effects are going to be permanent. Some of those jobs that went away are not going to come back, and that's particularly in those restaurants and other kinds of service industries are probably not going to be coming back. So there's going to be a residual problem of unemployment in California for quite a while. I would look several years probably at least. And even when the overall economy maybe picks up, we're still going to very stubborn problem of unemployment. So this is going to be a challenging period for California. Not only we have all these old issues that I mentioned earlier that have not yet been resolved, we have a whole flock of basically kind of new issues, or at least heightened issues, that will dominate the political landscape in the months and probably years ahead. And I guess the most pessimistic view would be that California kind of reached its peak. Before this pandemic, we saw a record low unemployment in California, down in the 3% range, 3.5% range. Never had seen that before. Maybe it's that turning point. We don't know. Is it a tipping point, a turning point? Will we see California decline because of our unresolved problems that have become more heightened during this pandemic? Or will there be, in fact, another renaissance? We don't know. We can't really take anything for granted anymore. The world is upside down in many cases, and the kind of favored place that California has enjoyed for so many decades, being the cutting edge place, the things were happening, the kind of the generator of stuff. Who knows? Are we still there, or have our collective problems caught up with us? And maybe this is, if not the beginning of the end, maybe we've seen this happen before. We have seen great civilizations die before. We have seen tremendous changes even in our own country. And I leave you with this, that if you go back one century to 1920, the happening place at that time, the Silicon Valley of its era, the place that drew all this capital and entrepreneurship and creative action, was Detroit, as it created this entirely new industry. It was the Silicon Valley of its time. But it was taken for granted. It was assumed it would always be there. And we know what happened to Detroit. It just kind of crashed and burned. It went away. And we always have to be aware that we can't take anything for granted. To maintain prosperity and economic prosperity and economic equity and more opportunity for people to get ahead, it has to be nurtured. It just doesn't happen by accident. And we need to pay attention to that.
Yes, Dan, I have a question. First of all, though, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. As every year when you come, it's the best attended meeting of the entire year.
Well, that's good. Oh, I guess.
We always enjoy and appreciate you taking your time to come visit with us. The affordable housing issue that you brought up, if I see that correctly, isn't one of the major challenges there is if that's what those housing units are costing, and you also have rent control, how can a developer or a builder get the rents that they need to be able to build those units?
Well, they don't have rent control now, to the degree that some people would like to have it. The rent control measure that was passed by the legislature earlier this year, I guess it was. I lose track of these things sometimes. In response to the pandemic, really, was very limited. It applied only to older units and that sort of thing, and it allowed 5%, as I recall, 5% increase and so forth. The real rent control advocates want something much tighter than that. They want something like they have tried to do in places like Berkeley and Santa Monica, but it's very difficult to do because of a state law passed about, I think about 30 years ago, that basically put a very tight limits on what local governments can do in the way of rent control. Now, one of the other ballot measures, Proposition 21, that was soundly defeated, another one that's back for the second time, would have removed that law and basically empowered local city councils and county boards of supervisors, particularly city councils, to go ahead and do rent control at the local level. That bill passed. This failed, excuse me. That measure failed miserably by about a 2-1, let's see, about 3-2 margin. So we basically don't have much in the way of rent control, particularly on new units. The state thing only applies to older units, doesn't even apply to newer units. We don't have rent control now, but there's always the threat of rent control, as witnessed this ballot measure that was on the ballot for the second time. And that threat does discourage private investment, as well as all the other impediments like CEQA, like the clear reluctance of local communities to accept high density, lower income housing in their communities. There are a lot of hurdles to do it. And until those hurdles are modified or go away, we're going to continue to see low levels of construction of new housing for in the greatest need. We're going to continue to see single family housing, probably enough. Our population isn't really growing very fast anymore, but the greatest need is for low and moderate income rental housing. That's where the greatest lack is in terms of investment. And it would take a lot of guts for the legislature and the governor to say, you take on environmentalists, labor unions, and local governments to overcome these hurdles and actually open the door to the kind of investment that would be needed to fill the need. And when you start multiplying $400,000 or $500,000 by the demand, the need, you're into tens of billions of dollars needed every single year, and it's just not there.
Dan, again, thank you. When your analysis of California and the liberal conservative nature, how does economic activity, employment, et cetera, that whole nature of economic activity factor in to that analysis?
Factors in a great deal. Over the time of the last 60 or so years, not only have the politics of California changed, it has the cultural ambiance of California changed, but its economy has changed, and they are all intertwined with one another. And I mentioned one aspect of that was a decline of the aerospace industry in Southern California after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s. It completely changed the cultural and eventually the political nature of that region by having all of these aerospace workers depart. Those aerospace workers were registered Democrats who always voted Republican, for the most part anyway. They were the so-called Reagan Democrats. And they had a great deal to say, a great deal of influence on the political ambiance of Southern California. And when they left and were replaced by recent immigrants, it changed the whole the economic of that area changed, the culture of that area changed, and the politics of that area changed. By the same token, you see the influence over time. I mean, let me back up. Over time, what's happened in California's economy is that we were a resource economy for the first century of our existence, roughly from 1850 to 1950. Although during World War II, let's say the first 90 years, because during World War II, we started building up this industrial plant, steel mills, auto factories, petrochemical. We had a tremendous industrial sector in the years following World War II, but it only lasted about 20 years, about 30 years, I should say. By the mid 70s, the industrial sector was declining, and we saw the conversion of California's economy from had been a resource economy, then into industrial economy, and then starting in the late 1970s into a post-industrial economy rooted in technology, services, and mostly technology and services. So there were still elements of the resource economy and the agricultural economy. There were still elements of the industrial economy here and there, but basically the whole nature of California's economy shifted over to these other form, post-industrial forms. And that then created a different labor market. The new economy, the post-industrial economy, had a great need for people with high levels of education and technical expertise, and rewarded those people. And you see the fruits of that in the Silicon Valley. That economy also had a great need for people with few skills, but physical labor, whether it was changing sheets in a hotel, washing dishes in a restaurant, loading boxes in a warehouse, all of that physical labor, but didn't take a great deal of skill. So we saw both ends of the economic sector of the labor market increase: the high tech, highly paid people, and the low skill, lowly paid people. We saw the beginnings of this division into a society, a two-tiered society. And that conversion had all sorts of impacts on things like commuting patterns, retail business, politics. I mean, up and down the line, everything you can think of. It meant, for example, that you didn't have to be located, industry did not have to be located on a seaport or a rail line. You could have stuff disconnected from transportation hubs. So you saw this big increase in service industry in the East Bay area, for example, along the I-680 corridor. You saw all these jobs sprout up that were not connected, didn't have to have a seaport, didn't have to have a railhead, didn't have to have any of this service type work. And it changed commuting patterns, it changed everything, it changed politics. So you cannot separate out economic change, cultural change, and political change. They are all connected. And if you want to know how our region is going to react politically on the long run, you need to look at where they are economically and culturally and to see where they're headed. And it's a very, very complex matrix of factors that go into political change. It isn't just one candidate, one election, even as polarizing as Donald Trump was. The larger changes in politics are not connected to one person or one party. They are really driven by socioeconomic factors that have nothing directly to do with politics. But that's where the real action is. Politics really is kind of the end game of social and economic change.